Hello, friends. My name is JJ, and I'm out here at 4 a.m. in my home city of Vancouver, just going for a nice morning walk. In a few hours, I am going to be going to Japan. Longtime viewers will know that I actually lived in Japan from 2008 to 2009, so getting close to 15 years ago. I was working as one of those ESL teachers straight out of college, and I was not particularly happy. I often say it was the most miserable year of my life, and I think I generally stand by it. I was rereading a journal that I kept when I was there, and yeah, a lot of misery, I would say, defined my life at that time. You know, I was very lonely. I didn't have a lot of friends. I didn't like the work that I was doing. And I endured it for a year because I felt that was important. I had signed a contract for a year and I upheld that contract, but definitely I was glad to leave when I did. But, you know, that was a long time ago now, and I think more about that experience in an increasingly sort of sentimentalized way. You know, I think the mind has a natural tendency to forget bad memories and remember good ones. And there were good parts of Japan. But, you know, even though it was a long time ago, it is still something that I think about a great deal. It is still something I talk about a lot. If you're friends with me, you know that this is something I bring up constantly. You know, I often quote anecdotes from my time in Japan, as I think anybody who spent any period of time in a foreign country has a tendency to do. But as the time continues to pass, as the bad memories fade a bit, as my sentimentality and sort of like longing and curiosity about aspects of my life there tend to take over, I've been thinking more and more seriously about going back at some time. The other day, I just kind of impulsively thought, you know, I should stop just thinking about maybe going back someday and actually bite the bullet and do it. So I'm going to go back for 2 weeks, going back to my old neighborhood. It's not a particularly ambitious trip. I just kind of want to see my old neighborhood and stuff, see some of the remnants of my old life, see how many of the things that I did and enjoyed doing are still possible to do, how many of the shops and stores and restaurants and things I used to love are still standing. You know, it's a long time since 2008. I imagine that a lot of the city and larger sort of, community have changed since I was last there. But I'm curious to see. I'm curious to see what is there, what is not there. I'm curious to see what sort of emotions returning there brings out in me. To what extent it is a nostalgic and sort of joyful experience, or to what extent it is, you know, maybe a somewhat painful or re-traumatizing experience. I don't know. I honestly do not know. I just know that this is probably going to be a meaningful trip for me one way or another. So just going to enjoy the rest of my walk, and then I'm going to take a taxi out to the airport, and we'll be on our merry way. I hate long flights, but luckily Vancouver is about as close as you can get to Asia, so it's only 10 hours.
お乗り換えです。今日も JR 東日本をご利用くださいましてありがとうございました。 I can't help myself. I just have to see my old neighborhood right away. It's so weird being back here. All of these long forgotten memories are suddenly flooding back. So many random little things that were once a big part of my life, but I haven't thought about in years. Like this Chinese restaurant where I used to always go for dinner after work, or the big Japanese Walmart at the end of the street where I did all my shopping. This creepy bunny poster, or how a lot of windows had these little red triangles on them for some reason. Here's the ESL school where I unhappily worked. Oh man, and here it is. This is kind of emotional for me, but this right here is the place where I used to live for a whole year. You can see there's a light on in the window, so I guess someone is still living there. It's kind of hard to express what it feels like to be here. Things haven't changed very much at all, so it really feels almost like I've traveled through time and I'm retracing the steps of my younger self. I've never had an experience quite like this before. It's really surreal. It's so uncanny, but I guess that's also kind of the experience I was looking for on some level. So,
You might be wondering where exactly in Japan I even am. Well, it is a province known as the Saitama Prefecture, right next door to Tokyo. And given my interest in boring middle-class culture, it is actually a pretty good fit for me, given that boring middle-class monotony is basically the only thing Saitama is known for. If you are familiar with the show Shin-chan, which is about a very stereotypically middle-class Japanese family, that is supposed to take place in Saitama. And there was a cheeky poll done recently that had Saitama ranked as the most boring of all the prefectures, given how little it has going for it beyond suburban sprawl. So yeah, well, reconnecting with this place has been very personally meaningful for me. I don't know if it's necessarily the sort of place I would recommend visiting unless you also have a personal connection. Although I will note that Saitama does have the biggest and grandest mall in all of Japan, and that is certainly something worth seeing if you are coming to this country primarily to shop. It has now been a few days since I landed, and reconnecting with Saitama has inspired me to spend the rest of this video discussing a topic that I think you guys will find quite interesting, which is the culture of the Japanese middle class. Specifically, I want to reflect a bit on Japan's rich tradition of finding middle class objects to be a subject of sentimentality and humor, which I think is something you can only fully appreciate after spending some time in a place like Saitama. So, Japan is famously a very homogeneous society. This is a cliche that can be overstated, of course. I mean, Tokyo is a very diverse place, and after coming back 15 years later, I was struck by just how cosmopolitan the city is getting, which is something we can talk about more later. But outside of the big urban centers, the Japanese preference for the predictable and familiar is very strong. And it's something that noticeably affects not just like the social values and behavior, but also the more material side of their culture as well. This Japanese inclination towards sameness comes from a lot of different places. But in the material realm, at least, we could say that some of the big variables include the dominance of the Japanese national government over local authorities, the power of the Japanese national media, and the dominance of a few large national corporations in the Japanese economy. And what this means is that no matter where you are in Japan, there are some aspects of material life that are just a lot more likely to be universally recognizable than they would be in other places, certainly much more so than in America. For example, the other day I bought these little stickers at a store called Hands, which is this huge national chain selling all manner of supplies for middle-class Japanese homes. And this is unto itself revealing because stores like this just don't really exist in America. Hands is sort of like IKEA meets Walmart meets The Gap, in the sense that it's not just selling, lamps and pens and face cream, but also a kind of comprehensive bourgeois national lifestyle that you're opting into by shopping there. Anyway, I found these stickers to be quite interesting, just because they all exist to communicate specific messages, but they do so in a way that would just never work back home because the symbology they use would be way too local in nature. This sticker, for instance, is communicating a sort of motivational message about, which path do you want to take in life, the easy, mediocre path, or the challenging but rewarding path. But what I thought was particularly interesting is that according to my Japanese sign book, the way that this sticker is done up is actually in the style of a sign indicating local roads, not like a freeway sign or something, but just a sign that you might see in your own hometown telling you how to navigate various municipal side streets. And apparently there is a national standard of how such signs are supposed to look in Japan, which is why they can sell something like this all across the country. This one is a similar sort of thing. It is a somewhat melancholic statement about traveling, done up in the style of a Japanese train station sign. And again, the reason why this works as a consumer good is because most Japanese railways are run by a single national consortium, meaning that the quote-unquote normal way for a train station sign to look is understood the same way all across the country. This one I found to be even weirder because it is a parody of a help wanted sign. The joke is that it's advertising a very bad job, but the exact gag doesn't really matter. But I just thought it was kind of crazy how Japanese culture has such clear standards for even what something as arbitrary as a handmade help wanted sign is supposed to look like, that you can sell something like this. I was showing this sticker to random Japanese people, And before they even had a chance to read it, just by glancing at it, they were like, oh yeah, that's a help wanted sign. That to me is a testament to the strength of the Japanese monoculture. The fact that even knowledge of the most trivial things can be taken for granted as being broadly shared just because the cultural diversity is so low, even at the level of things like sign design. There are many downsides to low levels of cultural diversity, of course, but it does make communication easier. Because so many experiences of Japanese daily life are defined by national symbols, their shared visual vocabulary is much larger than ours. Another classic example would be this thing, which you may have seen before. There is an emoji of it, and people in the West use it to mean all sorts of random things. But in Japan, this is the new driver symbol, and new drivers all across the country have to put a magnet of it on the back of their cars, which I guess suggests that driver's licensing is regulated at the national level in Japan as well. But in any case, you see this symbol used constantly across Japan to signify anything associated with newness or inexperience, like easy mode in a video game or a beginner's class at the gym. And I think that's kind of enviable, to adapt a piece of middle-class mundanity into something so universally helpful. But again, it is also largely a product of the high levels of cultural homogeneity that the Japanese have despite living in such a large country. Along with adapting the symbols of middle-class life for the purposes of communication, I would say that the other big way the Japanese play with this sort of stuff is through deep sentimentality. Obviously, back home, a lot of people get very sentimental about symbols of middle-class American material life, especially certain foods and brands and food brands. But we got nothing on the Japanese. So here is an example. This is a very popular brand of sketchbook in Japan. It is made by a very old company that has been around for ages. And I guess a lot of Japanese people must have warm feelings for it from school or whatever, because man, you can buy a lot of sentimental gewgaws about this thing. I mean, in addition to this charming little miniature notebook version, I was also able to buy this little patch for the backpack and this adorable little keychain. And you see the same sort of thing with all sorts of other random objects of Japanese middle-class life. There are these huge cults of sentimentality around all sorts of miscellaneous consumer goods that are then repackaged and sold back to the public in the form of other miscellaneous consumer goods. So I bought a whole bunch of examples of this kind of stuff. This is a bath bomb based on a Generation 1 Tamagotchi. This is a mechanical pencil and a pad of notepaper based on a brand of mushroom-shaped chocolates. Here are some socks based on a particular brand of mayonnaise. And this is a chapstick based on a particular brand of glue. Now, this is all very heavily bound up in another unique phenomenon of the Japanese middle class, which is what they call Showa nostalgia. And I think that this is a very fascinating concept that we actually have to some extent in the West as well, although obviously we don't use that exact name for it. So officially, the Showa era refers to the long reign of the Emperor Hirohito, which lasted from 1926 to 1989. But in the casual way that Japanese people tend to use the phrase these days, Showa more specifically refers to the decades immediately following World War II up until the late 80s. These were decades of great economic growth and prosperity for Japan, as they were for many places, and marked the country's greatest period of modernization and westernization since the late 19th century. Showa thus becomes an adjective describing a time of wealth and progress for Japan, but also describes a particular sort of late 20th century aesthetic vibe that has become a source of considerable nostalgia among Japanese millennials and Gen Xers. The Showa times are also often explicitly or implicitly contrasted with the current age of Japanese history, often pessimistically called the lost decades, where economic growth has been a lot more stagnant, and some would say there has been a lot less dynamism in Japanese business and art. So for example, in the world of Japanese pop culture, it is very common to critically compare the Showa version of a thing with the more modern version of a thing. So like Showa manga compared to modern manga, or Showa Nintendo compared to modern Nintendo, or Showa Godzilla compared to modern Godzilla. The impression that I get is that even though Showa things are obviously much more technologically primitive and frequently kind of corny, they nevertheless possess a certain earnestness and imagination that you don't see as much in 21st century Japanese pop culture. Budgets may be higher, but where's the heart? But anyway, let's get back to some consumer goods. So this is a kind of wafer chocolate cookie thing that is considered a very iconic Showa-era children's snack. Japanese Gen Xers and millennials have super fond memories of buying them at the corner store with their allowance money or whatever. The most popular brand is Baikuriman. You can see I got my nice little Baikuriman pencil case and eraser. But the big thing is that these cookies always came with little stickers, either pop culture characters or just characters made up for the cookies themselves. And nostalgia being what it is, stickers from the Showa era now sell for hundreds of dollars in Japanese comic book stores. But when it comes to capitalizing on Showa nostalgia, nothing can compare to the miniatures craze. Miniatures are basically just tiny little plastic recreations of ordinary objects, everything from boots to cleaning supplies. They're a hugely popular type of toy, usually sold in blind boxes or these gumball type vending machines, and are marketed more to adults than children, just because they're kind of boring. And based on my observations, the big trend in miniatures these days is Showa nostalgia. You go to any store selling these things and you'll see row after row of miniatures claiming to faithfully recreate the objects of a very specific generation. I bought a bunch of them and you can see that they all say Showa in big letters right on the front of the box. This one is from Showa Collection 2, which looks like 70s era things. This one is part of the Showa electronics set, which in this case is a Showa era fan. This one is called Showa Mother's Memories, which has like a baby carriage and a sewing machine. I like this one because it's old coffee shop signs. I've been told that people are particularly nostalgic for the aesthetics of old coffee shops in Japan, which are seen as like the best embodiment of Showa vibes. So this stuff is all pretty cool, in my opinion. I think nostalgia for the aesthetics, creativity, and innovation of a few key decades of the post-war era is something that is pretty broadly relatable. In fact, the first few decades following World War II is something that I often talk about on this channel as one of the most culturally important eras in all of human history. So I like that the Japanese have a specific name for it and all of these ways to revel in it. A healthy sense of nostalgia can be a critical component for a productive future. I mean, obviously, it is possible to get trapped in nostalgia at the expense of moving forward, but I think that stuff like this engages with nostalgia in a healthy way, using memories of the past to inspire creativity in the present, and keeping alive positive memories of an era that I think was quite objectively worth thinking positively about. And on that note, let me just close off this video with a bit of reflection on my own past and what it's been like to return to Japan after taking a 15-year break. People often give me a hard time for hating Japan, but that's never been my position. I have always assumed that this would be a fine place to visit for a short period of time, but not a country that I would recommend living in or working in as a foreigner. I've now been able to experience Japan as both a resident and a tourist, and I have to say, I enjoy the latter experience a lot more. Being here on my own terms has been incredibly liberating. It's made me realize that I often did have a lot of fun on the weekends here. What made me miserable was having to go back to my awful job on the weekdays. But for the last 2 weeks, it has been all weekends, all the time, and I've enjoyed myself a lot. Tokyo in particular is really one of this planet's great cities, and it's gotten noticeably better since I was last here. A lot of the new shops and restaurants that have popped up feel noticeably more worldly and cosmopolitan. Notwithstanding what I just said about the Japanese monoculture, it does seem that the next generation of Japanese youth are very excited about being part of global trends and more interested than ever in the goings-on of the wider world. Based on what I've seen and the people I've spoken to, today's Japanese youth are traveling a lot more and broadening their awareness of the world outside of Japan, and have a lot of enthusiasm about bringing what they've experienced abroad back to their own country. In some subtle ways, I've also noticed that Japanese social culture seems to be getting a bit more relaxed and the people a little bit less uptight. It just feels like there's more change in the air, and that is inspiring, and I think a reason for optimism. You hear a lot these days about the idea of Japan as a society in decline, and there certainly are visible signs of this, particularly when you visit a stagnant place like my old neighborhood in Saitama. And though I have noticed a lot more immigrants than when I was last here in 2008, I do stand by my original conclusion that overall, this is not a fun place for foreigners to live. But if present trends continue, I can easily imagine that for some future JJ type kid in his 20s, maybe somebody who hasn't even been born yet, it will be. And that is a comforting thought for me as I leave this fascinating, complicated country once again.